Hello, I'm John Hesse, Hoka Presbyterian Church. I would like to read from Wise Words, a collection of children's stories by Peter Lythart. And the story I would like to read is Meriva, the Goatherd's Bride. Once upon a time, a goatherd who lived in a tall mountain in the north country visited the city south of the river. He brought his flock to the city each year to sell goats, fresh milk, and cheese. Then he would lead whatever goats he had left back to his mountain home in the north. As he led his goats toward market, he saw a young woman stumble as she pulled a wagon loaded with bricks. She fell to the rocky street and the wagon tipped over on her leg. As the goatherd ran to help her, she squirmed in a puddle of blood, trying to pull her leg free of the wagon. The goatherd lifted up the wagon and tore off a piece of his shirt to bandage her leg. Then, for the first time, he looked at her. Her hair was as thick as sheep's wool. Though she was not especially beautiful, and in fact rather plain, with one look, the goatherd fell deeply in love. He asked her name. Meriva, she replied, smiling in a way that made her face look sad. Ow, don't press so hard. I thought you were trying to help. Sorry. The goatherd wiped away the blood. There, that should be clean now. Not too much damage. Meriva's face twisted in pain. Do you think I will ever walk again? It hurts so much. Well, I think you'll walk again, the goatherd answered as he helped Meriva to her feet. He looked at the ground for an awkward moment, trying to think of something to say. Do you live here in the city? He finally asked, although he knew she did. I am a household slave to the nobleman who lives there, she said, pointing to a large house at the end of the street. That must be a very comfortable place to work, the goatherd said, as they began walking toward the house, with the goatherd pulling the wagon of bricks. Ah, she said, it is awful. I have to work day and night. I get little sleep and not even a day off. He makes me move bricks from one end of the world to the other. And the food they feed us, it's terrible. Here we are. Meriva smiled again, and her face looked even sadder. As she limped down the pathway toward the house, the goatherd called after her, I hope to see you again. The goatherd could not forget Meriva's sadness, which made him feel the way he did when he watched a cold rain outside the window on a dark afternoon. He tried to think of some way to save her from her terrible slavery. Rummaging through his pockets, he found a few coins, but not nearly enough to redeem her. He knew he could not sell enough goat's milk cheese to pay for her. What else? He counted up his goats. If I sold 20, he thought, perhaps I would have enough money to buy her. That would leave me with 12 goats to start another flock, and I would have a little bit extra to buy Meriva a linen dress. That evening, the goatherd appeared at the door of the house Meriva had shown him. A butler led him to the nobleman's chambers, where he was just sitting down to his dinner. I would like to redeem your slave Meriva. The nobleman looked at the goatherd's shabby clothes. Can you afford her? Oh yes, the goatherd said. I have sold 20 goats. He stretched out his hand to show his money. 15 pieces of silver? Usually takes 30, the nobleman replied, but in Meriva's case, perhaps I can make an exception. You may have her. The goatherd nearly threw the money into the air. He wanted to dance, and shout, and hug the nobleman, but he only smiled. What do you plan to do with her? The nobleman asked. I love her, the goatherd answered. I plan to marry her. The nobleman looked at him with surprise and pity. Well, then she may leave immediately. Get out by midnight. That's when we close the gates. The goatherd rushed to Meriva's room to tell her the news. She did not seem very happy, but she let the goatherd help her pack her belongings. As the clock in the city square was striking 12, they were walking through the gates of the great house into the city street. The next day, they were married in a chapel of the city cathedral, with Meriva wearing her new white linen dress. We should set out immediately, the goatherd said after the wedding. It will take 40 days to get to our home on the mountains. With the goat herd leading the way, and Meriva and the 12 remaining goats following, they set out toward the river. At first, Meriva was happy to be free. But the more she listened to her husband, the more she realized he lived in a small house. He had only 12 goats, and he could offer very few comforts to a wife. Even before they crossed the river, she'd begun to regret leaving the nobleman's house. "You don't expect me to get my clothes wet, do you?" she asked when they got to the river. The goat herd thought for a moment. "Let's do this. You climb on my back. I'll spread out my arms like this, like wings, and carry you across." Meriva did not much like the idea, but she let him carry her across the river. She screamed the whole way, and twice nearly made her husband fall over. When he finally got her across the river, he went back and carried each of his 12 goats to the other side. They'd been traveling for 3 days when the land became very dry. All the streams had dried up and there were no wells in sight. Because the goats had no water, they stopped giving them milk. One morning, the goat herd climbed a mountain, hoping to find some sign of water. As he turned the corner of the narrow trail, he saw an astonishing sight. A stream of water was flowing out of the mountain from a spring buried deep in the rock. The goat herd gathered every container he could find, filled them with water, and hurried back to camp to tell Meriva of his discovery. "Look," he said, "I've got water! I've got water!" "Where did it come from?" she asked. "I was climbing on the mountain, and there it was, coming from inside the mountain. It was amazing!" "What do you plan to do with that water?" Meriva asked. "Well, drink it, of course. It's our life. If we do not have water, we'll die." "You expect me to drink water that came from some mountain?" Meriva asked sharply. "It's probably dirty. Who knows what kind of animal have done who knows what in that water? Oh, no, sir, I will not drink water from a rock. At least," she added wistfully, "we always had plenty of water at the nobleman's house. Oh, I wish I'd have stayed. It was so pleasant and comfortable there." The goat herd pleaded with her. She finally agreed to drink, but the water tasted so bitter that she drank only a few drops. Day after day, she drank a few drops, complaining with each swallow. Eventually, the goat herd became so tired of her complaints that he moved out of the tent and slept outside. Finally, it rained, and the streams filled with water. The goat herd and his bride would not be thirsty again. One night during the next week, an animal came into their camp and ate all their food. When they awoke in the morning, there was nothing to eat. As far as the eye could see, there was no town or even a farm where they might find bread. "We're going to starve, aren't we?" Meriva said. "Is this why you brought me out here, to starve to death? Oh, it was better at the nobleman's house. I may have been a slave, but at least we had bread." The goat herd became so tired of her complaining that he moved out of the camp altogether and slept among his goats. A few days later, he noticed a small kid wandering up the mountain. Leaving the others, he followed the kid. Before he knew it, he was so high that he seemed to have entered heaven. Clouds swirled around him, but the kid was nowhere to be seen. Then the goat herd saw an astonishing thing. A field of golden wheat was growing on top of one of the clouds, as ripe and thick as it could be. "If only I could get something," he thought. "Then we could make bread." Just then the wind changed, and the cloud moved toward him, stopping right next to him. Not knowing quite what he was doing, the goat herd carefully put his foot out under the cloud. He sank a bit into the softness, but then his foot stopped. He grasped the cloud with his fingers and pulled himself up. With shaking knees, he stood up and found himself balancing on top of a cloud. He carefully made his way to the wheat and gathered as much as he could carry before leaping back onto the mountain. As quickly as it had appeared, the cloud was blown away. The goat herd ran down the mountain, calling out to Meriva. "Why are you making such a noise again?" she demanded. "I was trying to get a few hours of rest before I starved to death." "Sorry, dear," the goat herd said quietly, "but I could not help it. Look, something amazing has happened. I was following a kid up the mountain, and I came across a wheat field on a cloud. Look at all the wheat I gathered." It is enough to feed us for many days. Did you find the kid? Meriva asked. Yes, dear, I found it on the way down. But look, we'll not starve. You want me to eat bread from a cloud? How do I know what it really is? Oh, no, sir. You will not get me to eat bread from the sky. Besides, I'm in the mood for meat. I was tired of bread anyway. Since you caught that kid, why don't we eat him for supper? The goatherd pleaded, and Meriva finally agreed to eat bread made from the wheat of the sky. Still, she complained that she had no meat. But there is no meat, dear, the goatherd told her again and again. There is. Why don't you kill those miserable goats of yours? We can eat them. But then we'd have no milk, butter, or cheese. Nothing to sell in the village when we get back to our home. The goatherd explained, with these 12 goats, I'll begin a new flock, which will become as numerous as the stars of the sky. Oh, you're dreaming. Don't make excuses. Get me some meat. Soon after this, as the goatherd led the goats out to a grassy pasture, he saw another astonishing sight. Spread out before him on the hillside were hundreds and hundreds of fat quail. Instead of flying up when he came near, they sat still. The goatherd picked up one bird after another, tied their feet together, and hurried back to tell Meriva. Now she will be happy, he thought. We will have meat. Look at what I found. I was leading the goats on the mountain, and I came across hundreds and hundreds of birds. It was as if they wanted me to catch them. Now we shall have meat enough for our whole journey. Ah, Meriva answered, I was really hoping for some red meat, but I suppose this is better than nothing. The goatherd slaughtered and dressed 2 fat quail hens for dinner and cooked them over the fire. He sat one down steaming in front of Meriva. This looks delicious, he said. I guess it'll do, Meriva answered. It's not nearly as good as the food we had back in the city. They ate in silence for a while, with the goatherd relishing each bite, and Meriva picking at her food and making faces, just the way you do when your mother serves you liver or broccoli. By the way, she said suddenly, her mouth full of food, I've been wanting to talk to you about your little hut on the mountains. I think it'll be much too small. Maybe we should move into the village. I don't think I could stand living on the mountain. But the mountain's my home. I want you to live with me as my wife on my land. It really is a good land. The goatherd answered. Besides, if we moved to the village, I would not be able to tend my goats. Ah, the land doesn't sound so good to me. That reminds me of another thing, she said, her mouth still full of quail. Why don't you get rid of those goats? No one likes goat's milk's cheese anyway. I know I don't. Why not get some sheep? I tried sheep, the goatherd replied. They're hard to handle. They're so stubborn. If they don't get their own way, they put up such a fuss. I would rather be a goatherd. That night, while the goatherd slept among his goats, it began to rain. He crawled under a tree and listened to the rain pounding on the roof of Meriva's tent. He was just drifting off to sleep when a sound louder than rain on a tin roof made him sit up. It was coming from the tent. He jumped up and ran to the tent to find Meriva coughing and sputtering, her face looking white as wool. The quail, she whispered in a hoarse voice. It was poison. The rain pounded so loudly on the tent roof that the goatherd could hardly hear her speak. But I'm not sick, the goatherd cried. It was poison, I tell you. Oh, I never should have left the nobleman's house. I've come all this way to die in this wilderness. Why did I ever listen to you? Why did I ever agree to marry you? I never should have left the city. If I live through the night, I'm going back first thing in the morning. When she had spoken these words, Meriva gasped and became silent. At the same moment, the rain stopped. It is a horrible thing to record, but as it turned out, that was Meriva's last breath. Her husband sat by her bed all night, hoping she would revive, but she did not. In the morning, he buried her body in the wilderness, then continued his journey back to his mountain home. The goatherd lived on for many more years, tending his goats and traveling every year to the city south of the river. But he never remarried, and he never bought any sheep. The moral is from Proverbs 21, verse 19. It is better to live in a deserted land than with a contentious and vexing woman.
Honey, you should explain the kid in there is a baby goat.
And the kid in the story is a baby goat. Thank you very much.